Hello and welcome to the Car Care channel, and welcome to the 2023 Lexus LX. This is a 300 series Land Cruiser in a suit. This is the only way you will be able to get a taste of the 300 series Land Cruiser in the US. Toyota just announced a new model of the Land Cruiser, which is the 250. We will look at that when we get our hands on one and do an in-depth review. But this remains the only way to drive a 300 series in the US. So in today's video, we're going to revisit this. We've already reviewed this in the past, but we're going to revisit this. This is a different trim. We're going to see what makes this good and what makes it not good right after this. Let's start our technical review under the hood, where gone is the V8 and now we have a V6 that everybody's really upset about. Folks, this V6, it well more than makes up for the V8, at least in my humble opinion. Let's talk about this V6. This is the V35A FTS. 3.4 liter or 3.5, whoever. I think 3.4 is becoming more official. They kind of backed out of the 3.5. This is a twin turbocharged V6. Let's start talking about some of its mechanical stuff and we'll go from there. Starting from the top, this engine has plastic valve covers. Better made plastic valve covers than others, but still it is plastic. Time will tell, and this is becoming kind of a fashion in the automotive industry. This cylinder head is a two-piece cylinder head, very familiar design with Toyotas. If you've taken previous engines, look at them. It's a very familiar design. Nothing really have changed here. Basically, the bottom part is the actual cylinder head with the valves and the ports and everything. And then the top piece has the cams. It's kind of a cam cradle or cam tower. Now, this engine does have roller rockers and just hydraulic lifters. That's actually very familiar, very simple setup, carryover from previous engines. And then this has dual variable valve timing, VVTi. They are oil controlled, but they are the simple oil control, so the oil does not run through the valve cover and all that. You have a solenoid, the front of the timing cover, two solenoids, and the bolt that holds the VVTi gear. It actually has a little plunger, and that solenoid on the outside just pushes as a plunger, lets it go, and that's how it changes the timing. This is a much better design than the one that runs through the valve cover. Just less passages, less chances of things, and then the valves are just right there. They're very simple to, the solenoids, they're very simple to replace, and there's 4 of them here. Kind of a surprise that they didn't go with electronic variable valve timing on the intake on this engine, but they deemed it not necessary, and that's how they went with this. Now, the fuel system in this is Toyota's D4S, so you have both port and direct injection. So carbon buildup on this is not likely unless in extreme conditions, which could happen to any engine, even if it's not direct injection. It does have a high pressure fuel pump on the valve cover, very simple location. Nothing really about the fuel system is over the top here. Typical D4S stuff. And this is where this engine gets some good stuff, that there was not things over the top, except when it comes to the turbos. We'll talk about those in a little bit. Now, this engine has a very simple cooling system, unlike the LS500, which did have a management valve where it sends coolant where it needs to go and control. This doesn't have that. This is kind of like similar to the Tundra Sequoia. It just has a good old mechanical water pump, coolant hoses, and that's about it. Nothing really fancy about it. It's a very basic one. But what is interesting here, and similarly in the Tundra and the Sequoia, the cooling fan is mechanical, but it has a solenoid that can control how that cooling fan engages and disengages, in addition to the fluid coupling that normal mechanical fans have. I don't know why they did that, and I don't know why they insist on that, even though mechanical fans are very efficient. But if you went through the length of sending power to it, doing all this, why don't we just put electric fans? Perhaps the kind of the patina of Toyota trucks having that roar when you start them from the fan. I think that's what they went after, because you went to this length, just put an electric fan. Moving on from that, an iconic thing about the Land Cruiser. You go look at a Sequoia, you go look at a Tundra, they have a big radiator, but it's all right. It's just a Sequoia and Tundra radiator. The Land Cruiser is overbuilt. Not like the Tundra and the Sequoia. They're just built. This is overbuilt. The radiator is massive, just something you will not find in many cars today, and it is super high quality. I mean, this is one of the hallmarks of this car. Anything you touch under the hood, it looks exactly the same as the Thunder and Sequoia, but it's not. Everything feels better. Everything feels overbuilt. Everything is just better feeling, better materials. That's what the whole point of this car is. And going back to the mechanical construction here, the front timing cover. So for the longest time in the V8, we had cam tower leaks with the front timing cover leaks. So they found kind of a universal problem. See, what used to happen with these engines in the past, there is a weak spot where the cylinder head meets the block, and here's the cylinder head gasket, and then the front cover sits. That point where all these three components meet is a very weak point. They usually used to put a lot of sealer in that area, and if there is any hint of contamination over time, it's going to leak. And contamination being oil of any kind, even could be oil from your hand. They did something very interesting. They kind of went a long route to fix this problem. They fixed it. They put a two-piece front timing cover. So the back piece actually bypasses that area where it used to be a weak spot, and then the timing chain, all the components go, then the top cover goes on top of it. Adds more components, makes it a little bit more complicated for service. It does solve the problem, but time will tell. If we have this much sealer and this much component, it's going to be a bigger issue than the original one that they tried to solve. But going back to the timing chain, this engine has 3 timing chains, very similar to that of the 2G RFE. Very popular engine, very good engine. So there's one big chain that goes from the intake cam all the way down to the crank. Only intake though. And then between the intake and exhaust cams, there's a little chain that runs. That was a very good design. Initially, when you look at it, it looks very complicated, but time has proven that that design works and works very well. I mean, you look at a 2G RFE with hundreds of thousands of miles, you never have to do anything with the chain. You just keep going and going. So the other thing that they also kind of carried over from their good designs, the oil pump. The oil pump sits at the nose of the crank. It's part of the front timing cover. That's a very good design, and it has been proven again. Rarely will you find any problems with Toyota oil pumps because of that design. It's a very clever one, works very, very well. Now let's talk about the turbo, and this one has 2 of them. Potentially the Achilles heel of this engine. Truth have to be said, nothing is perfect here. This turbo is a small one. It's actually very small turbos on this engine. There's 2 of them. And then they are oil and coolant cooled. They do have an electronic wastegate, which they did have some issues with them in the beginning, but not this one though. And then the intercooler is liquid to air, and it proudly sits right in the middle, blocking basically everything. That's just how they deemed it working. And it does have its own electric water pump that circulates that separate coolant from the engine for the intercooler, and then you do have 2 front radiators, 1 for each bank. Don't know why we need 2, but we have 2. But here is the, not the good stuff. You notice the container that contains the engine coolant and the intercooler coolant. It's 1 unit. That is not a good idea, because if you have a crack, now you're dealing with 2 cooling systems that you have to bleed, drain first, then bleed, then do the whole thing. Why can't we just have 2 separate containers? I don't know. Probably some engineer won an award for that. Mechanics will not vote for that award for practical reasons. And the other thing is the 2 radiators. Seems kind of overkill, but they deemed it necessary. Then the turbo service. This has been kind of a problem because this engine bay, for lack of a better word, is extremely busy. Now, the previous V8 is busy as well, but once you peel all the covers, you realize it's a big engine, but it's not as busy as this one being smaller. This is the problem with this car. The engine sits so back, being a V6, you absolutely have no access for anything. Makes it very un-DIY friendly, and then the fan extends so much and the radiator on this is so massive that you really don't have a lot of room. You could fit a V8 here. When you look at the end of the engine, you have a lot, but there's so much like intentional filling of space. I almost feel like they did not want people to work here. And this is what potentially is the Achilles heel. I mean, you want to remove the turbos. It's a massive operation. It's worse in this than some of the other models. And then there's 2 air filters. There's 2 mass airflows. I feel like they kind of followed a little bit of a trend in the automotive industry with these little stuff. And service on this engine is not going to be simple. And that's going to drive the prices a little bit up. Kind of a surprise from Toyota, but they seem adamant with this engine. They're onto something. It is well made, although some models have had some issues, but not the LX. But they seem focused, laser focused. They do not want to sway away from it or change anything. However, they did actually already make changes to this engine from its original form, which was in the LS500 in 2018. See, in the LS500, they had a very clever coolant management system where they don't have coolant just circulating all the time. They could shut off coolant flow at certain places so they warm up faster. They dropped that here. That was kind of a surprise. And then the intercooler used to be 2 separate intercoolers, one for each side. That's where the radiators came from, because now you have 2 separate intercoolers with 2 separate radiators, which makes sense. But this has a single piece, kind of like the Tundra and Sequoia. It has a similar thing. But one thing remains, and this is, I guess, where things are typical line cruiser land. Everything you touch here, everything you look around is just overbuilt. The plastics don't feel the same. The radiator is not the same. Things are not the same. This engine is not assembled in the same place as the Tundra and Sequoia. And that is not to say that the Tundra and Sequoia are lesser. Well, they are. But you know what I mean. This is a 300 series line cruiser. It holds a place of its own in the Toyota lineup. Now, moving on from that, this powertrain actually came in multiple configurations in other models like the Tundra and Sequoia. But here we only have the one. We don't have the hybrid one, which is kind of an interesting decision. I feel like they did not want to experiment with the line cruiser platform with a hybrid, because the place for it is right there, the inverter. They did not want to experiment with it. But made it to this engine is a 10-speed transmission. Very interesting transmission because it is all new. There's something interesting about this transmission. 7th gear is direct drive, so that means you have 3 overdrive ratios, which is pretty interesting. And one thing had to be said about this transmission, spending some time with it, just kind of seeing how its cold cycle is, it's a very smooth transmission. Usually the more gears you have with cars, the more it'll be like hunting for gears, shifting, and we saw that with the 8-speed transmission from Toyota. This one, it's actually pretty good. It almost makes you not feel like you have 10 speeds. The ratios are oriented in a way where the shifts are not abrupt and huge, massive changes. It's very smooth. It works very good, even in cold. Like when you start it cold, it's pretty smooth. I really like this transmission. I just hope we don't have magical issues with it appear all of a sudden. Let's take a look underneath the Lexus LX, starting from the very front. See, this is where things kind of went down a little bit, but typical line cruiser style down. So before, you used to have multiple metal shields here. These are actually plastic, but just listen to this plastic. That plastic sounds stronger than some cars' metal. It's a very heavy-duty plastic, but it is nonetheless plastic. Metal is, of course, better, but that's what they did. It's all covered up here all the way to the back of the transmission. There is a little access hole for the oil drain. You do have a lift point right here for its straight part of the frame. But before that, you have some hooks here. Hook here, and only one hook going that way, not really here. It's pretty interesting that they decided to do that, but at least it does have hooks. Then we move on to the front suspension. It looks similar, but it's actually completely redesigned. I love this little cover here. It's only line cruiser designers will think of that. There's actually quite a bit of positive changes here and some not so positive. Lower control arm, big behemoth, has the ball joint part of it. Ball joint does have 2 bolts that separate it from the knuckle, but it is part of this control arm. The knuckle is aluminum. You look at the upper control arm, it's very similar. This does not have the hydraulic suspension. This has just a regular, this is an F Sport, so you just got a regular good old shock, very similar. Huge front sway bar. I mean, just look at this thing. Look at this sway bar. This is a massive sway bar. Perhaps that's what helps with it handling a little better. I mean, it's still a giant boat, but it doesn't handle like the 200 series. It just drives better. Now we look at stuff like this little cover. It sounds like metal, but it's actually plastic. This is where the body mounts to the frame. And this used to be wide open. This used to be one of the areas they used to corrode a lot in these. Now they put a little cover and a drain. Same thing on the other side, which is pretty cool. This is the 10-speed transmission, and I want you to see it from this side. It is a pretty massive transmission, but for being a 10-speed, it's actually not that big. It seems like the same size as the previous one. It does have a thermostat on the cooler to help this transmission also warm up quicker. So when you do any service, you're going to have to press this thermostat, typical business as usual, like other models with this thermostat. Then we look at the transfer case. This is a massive transfer case with, this is actually metal shielding that goes all around it to protect it when you go off-roading. Good news, this actuator now is serviceable outside. So you can pull it out of the transfer case without having to disassemble the entire transfer case, which is a positive change. Exhaust is a very interesting orientation. So two pipes merge into one here, and typical Toyota, and this is even the best Toyota here, very high quality. I mean, everything feels solid. You have this big resonator. It's kind of an interesting orientation. The reason for that is I have this giant void here, and then over here you have the world's longest fuel tank, kind of like the Tundra and the Sequoia. It's just a massive fuel tank all the way here. I feel like they meant to put something here, because even if you look up in the body, you have an opening for something and then nothing. Perhaps that's where they thought this was going to be a hybrid at some point. Maybe in the future they will come out with a hybrid model of this, but for now we don't. And the other change is the rear end. It is a little different than the previous one. Look at this spring. This is a massive spring that goes all the way to the top. It does have some insulators on it. And the other thing is this rear, big old rear end, very typical Toyota style, really has been the same design. They did tweak it a little bit, but it's trouble-free. This is the kind of stuff that you're going to look at it today, and 15 years later, it'll be exactly the same. And that's how this multiple arms supporting the rear end, and just arms you will look at now and you look at 15, 20 years from now, they'll be exactly the same. Other small things, you look at the sway bar here, it does have a cover in the back to protect it from being hit. It is a plastic cover, but it is a cover nonetheless. These are the little things that they think about. And then something has become kind of a fashion with Toyota. On their U-joints, they're removing their Zerk fittings. This one, you notice around it, there's no Zerk fitting, there's no service. These U-joints are actually sealed. They kind of figured if we have sealed bearings, we can have sealed U-joints. There's actually no Zerk fitting on these service. Some people will take that as a bad thing. I don't see it as a bad thing, but that's what they did. But then the Land Cruiser stuff. If you look at this right here, this hose, this is actually a differential vent. It goes all the way up high. Folks, if there's any reference to a Land Cruiser off-roading capability, it is that. That puts the vent super high, so if you go in deep water and mud, it won't make its way inside the differential. That's why they put it that high. Then we come around and look here. This is the rear brakes. Now we have integrated parking brake in the caliper. This is an electronic parking brake, this is where they modernize it a little bit. We didn't talk about it a lot, but this doesn't have hydraulic power steering anymore. This has electric with a motor outside. You can't really see it much with the covers, but it is electric steering and now electric parking brake. And then would you look at this magnificent sight right here? Folks, this car has 22-inch wheels. There is very little cars in the planet, perhaps none, that has a 22-inch wheel for a spare tire. This is a full-size spare tire. You will find, I mean, it's becoming hard to find a car with a donut spare tire, let alone a 22-inch full-size spare tire, and this one does have it, which is super interesting. Of course, still has that chain that as you go in a drive-through, you'll hear it rattling around. Certain things never change with the Land Cruiser. And then the muffler exits on one side with massive opening right here. That is just how they do this. Very high quality stuff. You notice this is a car they don't skimp on the little details. This is covered, and this side is equally covered right here. They don't just leave open voids just for things to collect. This does have a trailer hitch, and with 2 style outlets. The trailer hitch is actually hidden underneath here, which is pretty nice. It's covered up so it wouldn't intrude. It's always there. Doesn't get rusty with time. When you need it, you take this cover and use it. It is right there for you, and it's part of the car. It is not an accessory to get a tow hitch on this car. Let's take a look at the outside of the Lexus LX. Starting with the front, it still has the spindle grille, and again, it is objective. I think it looks pretty good on this car, but that is very, very objective. Now, different than the other trims, this is the F Sport, they do have kind of a different grille. I think it looks even better. This color, I really like this color. Headlights are pretty large. Again, this is a very large SUV, and you notice the L is extremely emphasized here. I think the front of this car looks really good. It does have a lot of kind of hints to the Line Cruiser. This dip in the hood, it's actually very cool when you look at it when you're driving. It's just gives it a very special character. Then as we wrap through the side, there's not much going on the side. These are slightly raised, but not too much. Same thing in the back. The wheel arch is body color, which looks very nice in this. And then the wheel is a massive 22-inch wheel. Because this is such a massive car, you don't really realize that this is a 22-inch wheel. Folks, that is a huge wheel. Then as we wrap around here, you have the F Sport badge, which we're going to talk about it a little bit toward the end of the video. This is actually a good F Sport, not a bad F Sport. You do have the side step, which is pretty typical with the LX. The Line Cruiser loses that, but the LX does have it. However, this one feels less integrated into the body. This is the one thing we notice. Like if you take it, you can almost live without it. You do need it in a truck like this, but it doesn't feel as integrated into the body as the previous generations were. Then as we wrap around the back has a weird profile, and it's a functional one, but it just feels like it just comes in and just drops. There's no bumper in the back, so any hit here will damage the back door. But they do that because they want to maximize the space inside, which with the third row seat, it is a little small. We'll look at it in a second here. Love the bar taillight here. It's a very exclusive look, very classy looking. Love the Lexus written out. It looks, again, very exclusive, very classy. Doesn't look, you know, generic. They used a very nice font here. That is very nice. One thing about this truck, folks, you hit anything, you're going to hit the back door. So if you own one of these, perhaps be careful. Let's open the back here, which is power. And then this is the first biggest change from the previous generation 200 series Line Cruiser. We don't have the split tailgate anymore, but they did give you the rest of the bumper here, so you can, I suppose you can sit here, but it's not as big and cool as the previous one. Now the third row seat is up. You notice we have very, very small space here. The Land Cruiser was never really about hauling stuff and family. You know, so when the third row seat is up, you don't have a lot of space. They are power folding, so let's fold them down. That beep tells me that this mechanism has not changed in a very, very long time, because this is a very old school mechanism. They do have their things when you put stuff in their way and it gets jammed, but otherwise they're extremely reliable. But the one thing I love, and this is, you buy this for the quality of construction, not really the gizmos and all that. If you look here, even here, the very nice soft material comes all the way down here. They obviously did not continue it to the bottom because this is where you're going to put stuff and potentially we get damaged. But even all the way back here, you have this very nice material. Everything is put together very, very well. Now this is a kind of a new generation, so the motors are actually integrated into the shocks like everybody else. Unfortunately, the downside of that is, because we are talking about a Line Cruiser and this thing will last a very long time, when these go out, You actually cannot easily open and close this door, so you have to replace them. They're typically replaced in a set. They tend to be pretty expensive. That's the one downside. Now, this is the part where Lexus did. They put F Sport here, it's lit, and then another F Sport here, lit. This feels kind of overkill, but just in case you forgot this is an F Sport, we remind you twice. And then something that is also cool, this does have the 2 buttons here. I mean, we say that every single car has that, but remember, this is a Land Cruiser. It takes them 15 years to change it, so they added one more button. This one just closes the back door. This one closes and locks the car, which is a pretty nice feature. And then one thing that is cool as this door closes, so the entry to the 3rd row seat is not, you just fold this. This is a typical Land Cruiser thing. So you pull this and the whole seat stands up, and now you have entry. It is a pretty wide entry, and that is pretty cool, because they did lose the 3rd row seat that goes to the side. Now it's a normal 3rd row seat, so they made this, which is also pretty interesting, and I think it's a great idea. Let's take a look at the inside of the Lexus LX, starting with the past. This is the same story. Every time they take a Land Cruiser and switch it over to the LX, it ends up in the same result. You look at everything here, this is always old, conservative, not really flashy, what you expect from a luxury car, but that's exactly the point. See, what is special about this interior is not its amenities, it's the way it's built. Everything you touch here, even the plastic, just feels solid. There's no inconsistent gaps, nothing rattles, nothing is just cheap feeling. Everything is solid. But that's not thanks to Lexus. That's how the Land Cruiser is built. That's the whole purpose of the Land Cruiser. But then usually, somewhere in the execution and the transition from a Land Cruiser to a Lexus, things get done strangely, because this car was not initially designed to be this. This was kind of added on later. So there are stuff that don't feel natural. That's the problem. Let's start with the gauges. I mean, for a car of this price, you'd expect the gauge to be a little bit nicer. It's this tiny little, very old screen with mechanical gauges on the side of it. Love the mechanical gauges. They actually functional, they make sense in a Land Cruiser, but in a luxury car, it's manual gauges would have been fine, you know, analog ones, but they didn't. That's okay. Then the steering wheel. Love the steering wheel because it doesn't have Lexus's new thing where everything is on the heads-up display. This is very simple, very carryover from other previous models, which is fine. But then we look at the middle, which is where the real mess, sorry, no lack of a better word, starts. You feel like this was supposed to be the infotainment system, but by the time they were done developing it, this was a sample of an infotainment, so they added kind of a screen. This screen just feels like it just sits there. It's like a last-minute add-on. It doesn't even line up with the size of the center console. And this is Lexus's latest infotainment system. Pretty good. Can be glitchy, but for Lexus conservativeness and Toyota, it is pretty good. But then the screen underneath it, which controls like your mode and crawl and everything, it is such an old school screen that completely feels out of place. I do appreciate and understand it because it keeps things very simple, keeps all your driver and off-road stuff in one screen, but it completely feels out of place. But here's where things get worse. You're driving, you want to change the volume. There is this big knob, which in the 300 series Land Cruiser, this is the volume knob, and this is the tune seek. Well, here it's the mode select, and this is the 4 high, 4 low. And then the volume is all the way up here. A very unnatural position for the driver to extend like this, and then the passenger can't even reach it because this is a massive car. See, this is the add-on stuff that we're not really thought about. But that's okay. We can live with that because there are some good stuff, which as we make our way down, all your HVAC controls are physical button. All your heated and cooled seats and heated steering wheel are all physical buttons. All these physical buttons make this a very easy interior to live with, other than getting your morning exercise to change the volume. And this is kind of a hallmark of the Land Cruiser. It's a car that is supposed to wow you with its build quality but not annoy you to sit in and drive it. It is a simple car to drive, even though it's a high-end luxury car and whatnot. You get in here, it takes you nothing more than 5 minutes to be familiar with everything. Right here you have some more buttons, of course. Center diff lock, parking brake, hold is the same as your Corolla. It's exactly the same shape, same button. It works exactly the same. You shut off the car, you restart it, it resets to hold off. That's just how it works. Now, there is one thing that initially, in the initial review, I said, this is a very expensive car. Why do we still have to do this? But there was actually a purpose. If they put a motorized thing to close this, they would have to deviate heavily from the Land Cruiser platform, which did not have that, and then the headliner would drop down and it impairs on your headroom, which makes sense. And I don't think anybody getting into a Land Cruiser will complain about this, but things like this is what buyers at this price range will want. And that's where we go back to the problem of this interior. You get in this interior, if you're not looking at this car for the sake of quality and build and kind of materials and how long this thing is going to last, this will really disappoint you, because it's super conservative. It's too conservative, too basic. But as a Land Cruiser enthusiast, you're going to love it. It's every bit as much as a Land Cruiser. Mechanical, big shifter right in the middle. Everything is built like a tank, and nothing rattles. Even the plastics feel strong. But buyers at this price point, they don't care. They want gizmos. And this simply doesn't have anything. Now, one thing that it does have, which is cool, I think, the center console opens from both sides. But not only that, you actually have a button in the back that also opens it so the back passengers can get in here, because here is another Land Cruiser special. This has the cool box, which is pretty cool. Now, in the ultra luxury model, which is a lot more expensive than this, we did not have a wireless charger in the front. This is an F Sport model. We do have a wireless charger, which is actually a pretty smart place. You just put it here, your phone is right in front of you, and it kind of disappears from everything. I actually like that. Let's take a look at the back seat of the LX. So I am 5'7". This is my driving position. I have some knee room. It's not huge, and that's the thing about historically the Land Cruiser. As big as this car is, it doesn't have huge space inside. A lot of headroom though. It is a very comfortable. But the nice thing is, when you sit here, my thigh is rested on the seat. And that's something I'm noticing with newer cars. The seats are getting lower and lower and lower to give you more headroom. This one is not the case. A lot of stuff here, and something about this back seat, it's very wide, and it is a bench seat. You do have your 4-zone. This has 4-zone climate control, so there's 2 zones in the back. You do have vents here. You have vents in the headliner. That usually car manufacturers, just for your information if you don't know that, putting a vent on the pillar is a lot cheaper than putting a vent in the headliner, which means they had to run ducting on the behind the headliner, which is a lot more complicated than running vents on the pillar. Just thought I'd say that. That's why they went here, not here, and that is a Land Cruiser thing, not an LX thing. And then there is the little stuff with build quality. You notice this back of the seat. This looks like a plastic, but it's actually not. It's actually wrapped, not with the same kind of leather, but it is wrapped with leather. And this is a little stuff. They care about these little stuff, but they don't really care about the infotainment system and the big screen and the gauge and whatnot. And that's the heading of this car. Manual shade, not really automatic in power, and it's a super simple shade to attach. Some of these shades, you have to really fight them to install them. This one, I see my kids being able to do that, and they don't need to be pressing the power button up, down. But we have a problem. And that problem is buyers in this segment, they want to push a button and the thing whirs up. They don't care if it's going to break after 5 years. They just want it to whir up. And this is going to be a problem for them. Let's talk about the third row seat in the Lexus LX, since this is a model that has a third row seat. 2 passengers here, and the floor is extremely high. This is a body and frame truck. That's, I mean, this is not comfortable for adults. This is obviously meant for kids. But one thing about this seat, This way it is roomy, but the floor is way too high, and that's, again, there is a vent here on the headliner, which is nice. The one thing though, entrance into this third row is pretty nice. The seat completely folds up and stands up, so entrance to the third row is pretty roomy and kind of, it's a good idea, but the floor is too high here. That is the only thing against this third row seat. Let's talk about some things I do not like about the Lexus LX. First, this is a 300 series Land Cruiser, and a real big Land Cruiser. There's not much not to like about it, and that's the thing. From a Land Cruiser perspective, this is Land Cruiser business as usual. Overbuilt, built like a tank, very serious off-roader. But here is the typical Land Cruiser problems, at least in the US, because we don't really have trims in this, and the Land Cruiser, same thing. This is a very serious off-roader, and when you look at their marketing material, and this is the problem, the execution. When you look at their marketing material, they want to compete with the likes of the Mercedes GLS and the Infiniti Q80 and the Land Rover and the Range Rover. I'm sorry, this will crawl over the GLS. This will outlast its seventh ancestor, and it'll crawl over it, anything off-road. Land Rover, this is meant to tow the Land Rover back from the mountain when it breaks down. So is the Jeep Wrangler, so is everybody else. This is built or born as an off-roader that is very reliable, and it's overbuilt. Well, it'll never let you down in the middle of nowhere. But then it has 22-inch wheels, and it has a very low valance in the front because they're trying to make a luxury car here. They're trying to compete with the GLS, the Q80, which is basically a failing luxury car. That's the problem. It's not the car itself, it's the heading. And then the gizmos they try to add to it feels rushed, feels not really thought about, because they took the 300 series Land Cruiser, which is proper, focused, and they unfocused it to make it this mirage of luxury. This is not a luxurious car. It's in its DNA. You start going over bump, it feels like a truck. It's heavy, it's just big and solid. And that's its design. You can't make it soft. No matter how much leather you throw at this, it's still a Land Cruiser. No matter how many screens and gizmos you put in it, all you're gonna do is drive its price up. That's the problem, the price. Land Cruiser enthusiasts, here's how the cycle goes again. We saw it with the 100 series, 200 series, and now with the 300 series. Nobody will buy this new because it's too expensive. And then when Lexus sees that nobody's buying it, they're gonna kind of lay off the marketing, and even less people will buy it. And then 5-6 years from now, everybody will want this because the Land Cruiser enthusiast now has this car within their price range. They'll start buying it, the price will go up, and it'll become this hot collectible. Sound familiar? That's the story with every single Land Cruiser. Nobody bought them when they're new, they bought them when they discontinued them. That's just how this goes, and this has exactly the same problem. So should you buy a 2023 Lexus LX? Folks, there has to be one thing that is said. I, with all my heart, love this thing. I mean, it is every bit as much a Land Cruiser as the past. Some have had concerns that this is kind of on the softer side, the 300 series have lost the magic. Some of them might be true because the V8 is gone and all that, but remember there was a day where the Land Cruiser never had a V8 and it was still every bit as much a Land Cruiser. This is that one. This is a true Land Cruiser. Not from infotainment and interior gizmos, whatnot, but the build quality. Everything is not just built well, it's overbuilt, and everything is the same thing here. But equally here is the problem with the Land Cruiser since right around the 100 series, actually, this problem started. What is the target audience for this truck? Let's call it a truck because that's what it is. What is the target audience? Because the problem is all the Land Cruiser fanatics, they will not pay $108,000 for this, let alone the $128,000 for a ultra luxury model with the reclining back seat. And the lowest price one is $91,000. And most Land Cruiser fanatics, We'll just look one good look at this and be like, this is too much. We're just going to wait for it to drop. And then people who are actually shopping in this price range, they will not appreciate it, because to them, they're switching cars every 3 to 5 years within the warranty period. And the quality of build and like the indestructible build of this will not really appeal to them. They want a flashy car that will make all their neighbors envious and the latest and the greatest inside. This doesn't have that. This is the opposite of that. And that's the problem. We're still at the same thing. That's why they canceled the big Land Cruiser. Now we have a smaller one. They're finally responding on the Toyota side that people don't want the gizmos. They just want a really good off-roader, kind of like the 4Runner. That kind of proved the point. But this is the problem with this. This is one of the best SUVs, body on frame, real truck, indestructible, that you can buy. But at this price, many won't. This particular one is the F Sport trim. And for the longest time, the F Sport from Lexus have just been badly executed. That's just at least my humble opinion here. They usually take a very nice car, an ES, an IS, a GS, and they put very rough and jarring suspension and kind of ruin the whole point of a Lexus. And it still doesn't handle well for a sport hot model. This, however, I think they did it a little well, because aside from the appearance, which does look nice, it handles a lot better than the regular one. Even with not having hydraulic suspension, it's still. Now, don't mistake me for a very good handling car that's on rails. It's not, but this is a giant behemoth. You don't expect it to handle well. But something with the 200 series Land Cruiser and carried into the 300, every time you hit the brakes, the nose dives, and it just feels like a big floating boat. The F Sport, though, it doesn't feel like that. It's a lot better behaved. And that is a huge plus, and one of the first times and ones that will stick with my memory that the F Sport model actually drives well. Is not rough and jarring, but it is not floating as well. I love this. So does the Land Cruiser enthusiast, but it's simply too expensive. That's the God honest truth, because all these mini half-done gizmos that it has are unnecessary. This is not why people buy this. They buy it because it's built like a tank, and it still is in 2023. Folks, I hope this video is helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.